So for all of you who were here last week, we got to squirm in our seats a little bit as we learned about Hosea, who is probably one of the most awkward of the prophets that we have studied so far in our heroic prophets of the Old Testament series. I say awkward because Hosea was called by God to marry a prostitute named Gomer, whose name literally means dead end. And he was also called to have children by this woman whose names meant no mercy and not my people. I'm not sure whether we ever had a satisfactory answer as to why God would call Hosea into these circumstances, but it was safe to say, I think, that God wanted Hosea at a very human level to experience the same kind of heartbreak that God experienced because of Israel's unfaithfulness. So, I am sure that you all would like me to say that we're moving on from Hosea this week, but that's not the case. But I think this week's passage might be a little more relatable than what we dealt with last week. And if last week's passage was relatable, I know some really good marriage and family therapists in town. I'd be glad to give references. But hopefully this week's isn't quite as shocking and awkward as last week. As far as relatability goes, I think parents will probably connect to this week's scripture. And if you're not a parent, I am not trying to deliberately exclude you or anything like that. I'm just saying that the words and images the prophet uses here sound very much like the parent who can't wait until their child learns to walk and talk, and then when they do, can't believe what they say and do. I've been there before, let me tell you. And I got to tell you this story. When we lived in Virginia, we caught the tail end of a pretty big hurricane that hit the coast. And we were pretty far inland, but that hurricane hit hard. And it blew a lot of debris all over the neighborhood. A lot of rain came down. I am not. More than one way to skin a cat here. Yellow? Yay. So anyway, here this hurricane came in and blew all of this debris all over the neighborhood. It was rainy and muddy and yucky. And the thing is I was away on a business trip when this hurricane came in and destroyed this neighborhood. But before I went on the business trip, I'd do this with my children. I would tell them that we would do something special when I got back. And before I went on that business trip, I had promised one of my children, who will go unnamed for soon-to-be obvious reasons, that he and I would go on a big bike ride when I got back from this trip. And so I got back from the trip, and this child and I were in the garage. Garage door was open. We had our bikes, and we were just kind of surveying the outside and the damage. When all of a sudden, out of the blue, this child says, "I'd really like to go out on that bike ride today, but it's just too effing muddy." And there I was, caught in that awkward moment where my child said something ridiculously inappropriate, and I had to respond. Now, parents fully understand the inevitability that one day our children will utter that word, right? It will happen. And maybe you prepare yourself for this moment. Maybe you've thought this through and maybe even developed a scenario in your mind of how you'd respond when the day finally came when your child says that word. Maybe you even came up with a little speech that you rehearse in your mind and you say, "Young man, we do not use words like that. Those words are crude and inappropriate and should be never spoken out loud in public or private. You go to your room and you stay there until you can come out and use good words and kind words." Good speech, huh? But on that day, when my sweet, kind boy finally uttered that word for the first time, I froze. And there I stood with tears welling up in my eyes. Not because I was sad or hurt or offended, but because I was trying to suppress my laughter. And that little speech that I had outlined and rehearsed in my head, out the window, gone. The only thing that I could manage to get out of my mouth was, "Don't you ever let your mother hear you say that word." As time passes and your kids get older and more autonomous, they start establishing their own values and morals and vocabulary. And sometimes the decisions they make and the paths they choose are different from what you may have envisioned for them. What parent hasn't been wounded by the child who refuses to hold on to what you treasure most? You know, we think, is it just me, or does my child somehow know exactly what to say and do to push me to the very edge of my sanity? This child whose every need I've provided for, this child who I've cleaned up after, this child who is as good at breaking my heart as he or she is at filling it with joy. God, as the parent of Israel, seems to be in the same situation here. Back in the 1980s and 90s, there was a parenting book, a very popular parenting book out that was called The Strong-Willed Child. You ever remember that book? Ever read that book? Good book. That was Israel. The strong-willed child who knew exactly what buttons to push to send the parent into a tailspin of anger, despair, and frustration. Now, I was reflecting the other day about not only my experience as a parent, but friends who we've made over the years who have kids too. There's no such thing as a perfect kid, right? And there's no such thing as a perfect parent too. Got to remember that. We're all products of a combination of biological and sociological factors. In other words, nature and nurture. We pass down genetic characteristics to our children, some that we're happy to share and others we wish we didn't pass on. The traits that we pass on that we may not be happy about are, let's be honest, often the very things that we dislike about ourselves the most. Think about this. In moments of frustration, we may say, "Why is that kid so hard-headed and stubborn?" Which may prompt others in our lives to roll their eyes and say, "Yeah, gee, where did that kid get that stubborn streak?" What's that old saying? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But biology is not the only thing that shapes us. We are also products of where we were raised. We're products of our culture. We had a lot of missionary kids as classmates at Northwest Christian College. Now, I know, was there a lot of missionary kids when you went to NCC too? I don't know what it is. It seems to be a big mission-centered college, and so there was always kids who were raised in other countries. For example, there's one woman who did things kind of different because of the culture she grew up. For example, she would always indicate where something was by pointing her chin. So you might say something like, "Hey, do you know where Professor Lane went? I thought I saw him come through here." And she would point her chin to the door where she thought she saw him. And it wasn't a subtle nod either. It was a laser-precise line between the bottom of her chin and exactly where Professor Lane was going out the door. See, she grew up in tribal Kenya, among the Maasai people, where pointing one's finger was considered an obscene gesture. See, they give directions by using their chins. And if something is way, way far away, they stick out their tongue to indicate the extra distance. Her Raised in America classmates kind of thought this was a little weird, but we accepted her nonetheless. What we underestimated was the culture stress that she was experiencing. Because even though she was among people who looked similar to her, she knew that she wasn't one of us. And that's how Mary and I felt when we moved from Oregon to Tennessee. Oh my word, we'd go into a supermarket and somebody who worked there would always ask, do you need a buggy? And we had no idea what they were asking. We were like, a what? A buggy. Anyone here know what a buggy is in the South? A shopping cart. That's what they call shopping carts, a buggy. And then the employee would inevitably sigh and say, you ain't from around here, are you? And our kids experienced this too, coming back from Virginia, having been raised a lot in Virginia, coming back here to California, because they couldn't understand why kids made fun of them when they'd say yes ma'am or no sir to their teachers. Shoot, even the teachers made fun of them. And we often forget about how cultural conditioning factors into our behavior or our identity. And I think one of the most frustrating things for a parent is, despite spending a lot of time and effort modeling the family's values, the family's culture, the kid may choose a path that seems totally opposed to their family's ethics and morals. My parents' generation called it falling in with the wrong crowd. And I'm not talking about little things like the Methodist kid who wants to join the Episcopalians, or the son of the toy maker who wants to be a dentist. And yes, I got that from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. No, I'm talking about the kid who gets sucked up into a culture of crime, of substance abuse, or who affiliates with a hate group. It's heartbreaking to see parents who, despite their best efforts, cannot understand how or why their kids strayed so far away from the family's core values, the family's core culture. And that's what this passage of Scripture is all about. God is the parent who is caught up in the throes of despair, watching Israel make choices that are leading them to destruction. What happened to the little kid who was so happy-go-lucky, who thought mom and dad were the best people on earth, who was always so grateful and loving and loyal? What went wrong? And for God, it was what happened to this nation who used to be the prime example of justice and mercy and hospitality in the world. Why have they turned away from me in favor of Baal and all these Canaanite fertility gods? Why have they become so enamored with the Assyrians and the Egyptians and are making these sketchy alliances with them just so they can satisfy their craving for wealth and status? It is so hard for a parent to know what to do when your children have strayed so far. Now think about how many parents who have kids who are struggling with substance abuse. I can't tell you how many parents I know who have kids that are so addicted to drugs or alcohol that they have to keep their valuables hidden or locked away because their kids have stolen from them in the past just to feed their habit. Parents who have spent thousands and tens of thousands of dollars on rehab programs only to have their kids relapse. Parents who have sacrificed their retirement savings on court fines and restitution. The problem is that at some point the parents have to understand that if they continue to rescue their kids, they put their own health and welfare in danger. They come to the realization that what that flight attendant says before you take off on the runway is true. If you lose cabin pressure and those oxygen masks drop down in front of you, you've got to put that oxygen mask on you first before you can help somebody else. A number of support groups for parents struggling with their children's addiction advocate for tough love. That is continuing, don't bail your kid out when he or she goes to jail, right? Don't enable them to continue using by providing them with food or shelter. You aren't showing them love by enabling them. You're only setting up unhealthy patterns of codependent behavior. And some parents can't do this. They say, well, how is not being there to help showing love for my child? What if their lives are in danger and I am not there to pick them up when they fall? They don't understand that saying no to enabling their kids' addiction does not mean I don't love you. Because once the kid gets his or her life together and starts working their steps and making amends, that loving parent is there to welcome them back, much in the same way that the father welcomed the prodigal son back in Jesus' parable. Now, I wish I could tell you that as we wrap up this story in Hosea, and I wish I could say, and so God's people listened to Hosea's message, heeded God's warning, repented of their sins, and lived happily ever after. Like Amos, Hosea was active during the last years of King Jeroboam's reign. And we all know who King Jeroboam is because we studied about King Jeroboam a while ago, right? King Jeroboam's reign ended in 746 BC, and 20-some years later, in 722 BC, King Sargon of Assyria laid siege to Samaria, which was the ruling city in the north part of Israel there, in that northern kingdom, and he deported most of the nation's movers and shakers. And I think Hosea might have known already that King Jeroboam and that nation would not listen to God's message, but that didn't stop him from preaching. That's why he's a heroic prophet in my book. When God calls prophets to preach, they often go in knowing that they're only serving as harbingers of the inevitable. But every now and then, people hear, people believe, people return to God, knowing that God will receive them back as a loving parent would receive a prodigal child.